Tariffs. What do they even mean? And why is Donald Trump slamming them down on friends and foes alike in his second term?
They've been ripping us off for years. They've been making billions and billions of dollars. There was nobody to negotiate with. They could do whatever they want. They charged us tariffs, by the way, at numbers that we've never seen before.
The US says it's looking for equality to fix a trade imbalance. Trump says the superpower is being fleeced and that tariffs will fix that. Citing history, he says they have worked before. But have they? On this episode, we speak with economic historian Brad DeLong, who says this is chaos monkey economic policy. I'll ask him what that actually means and why he thinks the US is actually committing self-sabotage. If he's right, how will that affect the world? This is the InnerView. And Professor Brad DeLong joins us now on the InnerView. Good to have you on the program, sir. You're an economic historian, you're an economist, you're a professor. Donald Trump thinks tariffs are a great idea. Tell me why you think they are not.
Well, because all of world history, at least since 1870, and for a good part of it before, suggests that tariffs are an extremely bad economic policy move for three reasons. First, they create very large domestic rent-seeking interest groups that are extremely anxious that they continue. Once they're imposed, they're very hard to get off. And the people they enrich are people who are not so much productive as people who are very good at lobbying the government. And that is probably the largest kind of reason to object to tariffs, that once you impose them, you then have a very hard time to get rid of them. It took on the order of 50 years to get rid of the tariffs that were imposed during the 1930s and the post-World War II period. And that produced the biggest generational boom the world economy has ever seen. The second reason is that the value of the global division of labor is so absolutely great. That you would think that a country of 350 million people, or even of 100 million people, or even of 20 million people, would be able to establish a division of labor within itself capable of reaping most of the efficiencies possible by the fact that we can't do everything, and each of us is best when we specialize at doing only one particular thing in production. But that turns out really not to be true. That you truly need a near global scale economy to get anything close to the maximum amount of efficiency in the sense of producing the most useful stuff for us for the least cost. We see this in simply the total extent of all of the globalized value chains we have around us. We have a world in which the best treats for my two 75-pound dogs, the ones they enjoy the most and are the best price performance point for them, are small fish from Iceland dried on the shores of Iceland and then shipped to California via the Panama Canal. They're great. They make the dogs happy. They're better than alternatives we have found. They come from 7,000 miles away. And the third reason to eschew tariffs is that while there certainly are advantages to attempting to game the economic order in various ways, to get larger parts of the externality creating, the knowledge producing parts of global economic activity located in your own country. Being actually able to do this requires enormously delicate handling and an enormously large amount of governmental confidence and competence to impose the right nudges on the world economy to try to push economic activity into a more favorable global configuration to you. And a few countries have managed to do that for a while with extremely competent bureaucracies and focusing their tariffs on very small sectors. And most importantly, adding to them enormously productive industrial policies to support the tariffs that are the main event. And a US administration that can be best characterized as a large number of chaos monkeys in a cage does not have the competence to impose such tariffs,
Right.
but do anything other than cause random chaos.
Yeah, so you mentioned Trump's policy is a chaos monkey policy. You mentioned it in your Substack. We'll put a link to your Substack, by the way, at the bottom of the YouTube version of this interview when we're done, because I think it's a very useful place for people to go to.
I really do not know how to characterize.
Yeah, chaos monkeys. It's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so again, why do you think he's doing it? Because he makes the argument that, listen, there's a trade imbalance here. We're buying more from you than you're buying from us. So there's an imbalance. We need to get that figure, the other way, or at least to parity. I mean, technically, in and of itself, it isn't wrong, right? Tell me why that's not the whole story.
Well, I would say first that it almost surely is wrong. That the United States is buying more goods from other countries than we are selling goods to other countries. But the United States is exporting more services, to other countries than other countries are exporting services to us. And when you add up what we can count as far as the goods and services are concerned, it does look like the United States trade deficit in goods is a lot larger than our trade surplus in services. But if that were the case, then the United States would have been borrowing a lot from the rest of the world over the past generation or so. And in that case, we would owe profits, we would owe interest and dividends on that borrowing back to other countries. And that we would see that the net flow of financial payments, the difference between the profits U.S. property earns abroad that are then transferred back to the U.S. and the profits other countries' property in the U.S. earns there that are transferred back to them, that those financial flows would have shifted from being roughly balanced a generation ago to ones in which the United States is paying a lot of money in interest back on the debts that it has borrowed from the other countries in order to finance all the extra goods we bought. And we look at that, we simply do not see that. We simply see that the financial flows are about the same now. They are in balance as they were 40 years ago. And so if you started by simply looking at, has the United States borrowed a lot from the world over the past 40 years? And is the United States now paying a lot in interest on that debt to other countries that it's not getting back? That simply is not there.
Right.
And that makes Harvard's Ricardo Hausman think that the actual U.S. trade surplus in services over the past 40 years has been pretty much equal to our trade deficit in goods.
Interesting.
And that U.S. trade has, in fact, been balanced. And, that's a very powerful case, and I haven't found anything wrong with his argument yet, and I've been trying for a month.
Do you think the base knows who foots the bill? I'm just looking up at the wall. So, for example, we have him holding up, his reciprocal tariffs when he made the executive order or announcement. And so let me just take an example from there. Japan, 46%. I know it's changed. It's more like 25 now. But, okay, do you think that they know that it means that stuff coming in from Japan is now 46% more expensive to Americans, not to Japanese? Do they know that at all?
I do not think that the Trump base thinks very much about the actual nuts and bolts and the actual numbers of what he's doing. I think the Trump base sees somebody taking action. And somebody who looks to them like they think a leader should appear on television taking action. I don't think that there is a lot of quantitative thinking about, is this actually in our interest? Is this going to be a good thing for us, going on? There is just the appearance of motion and of leadership. and very little sense that this guy is doing anything other than being a leader.
But sorry to interrupt you, taking action because something's wrong, right? I mean, is this a symptom of the fact that the global economic order is broken? And even though he's doing something that you think is wrong, there's definitely a reason for the dissatisfaction, because if people were not economically dissatisfied with globalization, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, they wouldn't want change, would they?
They weren't. Well, except that when you look at what was going on in the United States last October, people were not dissatisfied with the economy as it applied to themselves. People overwhelmingly thought that their personal finances were in very good shape. People overwhelmingly thought that their neighbors seemed to be doing very well. But as my friend Dean Baker pointed out, there was a fairly strong divide between people who knew that inflation had come down from 8% to 2%, and people who knew that the unemployment rate was close to a record low and had been so for a couple of years since the end of the plague, and people who knew that incomes in the United States had been growing relatively rapidly, and people who did not, people who thought that inflation was still high, people who thought that unemployment was still high, and people who thought that while they were doing okay, there were an awful lot of people elsewhere in the country whose economic situation was actually quite horrible. And the first group, the people who had an understanding that their relatively good economic circumstances were largely mirrored in the country as a whole, they broke overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. And it was the second group, the people who thought that all they were doing pretty well economically for themselves right now, that the country as a whole was in horrible economic shape. They're the ones who broke for Trump.
Can you tell me?
And it was quite remarkable. It wasn't that people were hurting. It was that people had been convinced that there were a lot of other people in the country who were hurting. And that was, I think, the source of a large amount of the pro-Trump mobilization on the economic side.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'd love to look into that data. So it's not so much about me, but it's about what I think the situation is of others. How you mentioned at the very top that this would take many, many years sometimes to reverse when it comes to tariffs, whether it's Japan or South Africa or China or whoever, right? And so when you do this, once tariffs are set, it takes a long, long time to reverse this. The fact that the United States is a democracy, maybe some people would say still a democracy, the fact that things can turn on a dime and you get a new administration in, could they reverse all of this? How consequential is this? How consequential is this man and is this economic policy 4 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line?
We really do not know. Right? The hope, or at least the hope from all the Republicans or ex-Republicans I'm talking to who aren't people who believe that chaos is a ladder and this is going to be good for me, never mind how bad it is for the country or the world as a whole. The hope is that politics will go back to normal as soon as Trump passes from the stage, because he is in a unique position with unique advantages, unique competences, and also a unique past mass media history of having been portrayed as a strong and competent executive on his TV show, for more than a decade. And that this will all appear to be a bad dream as soon as he passes from the stage, and kind of normalcy will reappear. The bet is that is almost surely wrong, because Trump is part of a surprisingly large movement that you find surprisingly many countries around the world, of people who are populists, but not. Historically, all the way dating back to 2,500 years ago, a populist was someone who rose to power by telling the people that there were oligarchs, clan leaders, rich plutocrats, whatever, who had been rigging the economic game in their particular favor. And that what the people needed was a champion. And the champion would curb the economic interests of the oligarchs and the plutocrats and the clan elders and the rich. They would cancel the debts. They would redistribute the land. They would give a fair shake to the little guy by redistributing property and authority. And as long as the people backed him, he would make sure this would happen. And so they should make him, tyrant of Syracuse or dictator of Rome. And we have these movements throughout history over the past 2,500 years, with them, all of them being, cancel the debts and redistribute the land. In, say, the more recent incarnations, and someone like Louis Napoleon in France after 1848, it's that I am going to keep the aristocratic landlords from taking the farm you won in the French Revolution away from you. I'm going to keep the aristocracy from coming back. I'm going to preserve the liberties of the revolution. In the case of America's Andrew Jackson, it was, I am going to stop the land speculators from getting corrupt politicians to tell them where the good land is and for buying it up before you can buy it.
They do cite history. They do cite history with, was it President McKinley?
Yes,
and so they say tariffs worked then, so they'll work now. Tell me why, as an economic historian, you don't buy that.
Well, tariffs didn't work, except to the extent that they were focused very narrowly on a few cases of particular goods in which the United States could become massively, massively productive because of the scale of the continent and because of the huge amount of investment needed to develop the country, but that those businesses would not have a chance to start because the existing British competitors were much more productive. And if British goods were allowed in tariff-free, the United States heavy metal bashing and high technology machine making industries would not have a chance to get started. When you have that opportunity, when you have the opportunity to rapidly build out a community of engineering practice, if you can get your foot in the door with the investment goods and the manufactured goods industries of your country, there is a very strong case for tariffs. But that's not imposing a 46% tariff on Japan based on fictional non-tariff barriers that do not exist.
Right. Okay. I'm glad you made that distinction. Yeah.
But the point I wanted to make was that none of the modern populists are delivering. None of them are redistributing the debts, canceling the debts. None of them are redistributing the land. Instead, they're offering people the kind of vicarious participation in, I am a strong leader doing stuff and you in some way participate in that. It's not that I'm actually getting you a farm, not that I'm getting you cheap grain. It's that I am leading the country in a good direction and I am punishing your enemies. Right. And you should be happy with it. And we find that from Modi in India casting the Muslims of India in the role in which European countries traditionally cast the Jews as the alien other who is corrupting our civilization. You get that in Trump. You get that in Orban in Hungary. You get Nigel Farage in Britain, and this extraordinary episode over the past 10 years in Britain, in which they made themselves 10% poorer.
You think Brexit did that? I don't want to say you think. Does the data suggest that Brexit made Britain poorer?
The data strongly suggests that Brexit has cost Britain 10% of its potential prosperity now. There are people who argue that the real sea change came in 2007, Martin Wolf, for example, and that's when British growth stopped. But I see two episodes. I see 2007 to 2016, when the consequences of the plague and the austerity delivered a hammer blow to the British economy. And then 2016 to the present, when just as the British economy was recovering from that, Brexit all of a sudden threw a huge amount of bureaucratic sand in the gears of the British division of labor, and they lost a great deal of their ability to integrate with Europe and did not gain, in spite of what Boris Johnson and company said, did not gain a free trade zone with the United States or whatever they claimed they were going to get.
It's worth mentioning to our viewers that you were involved in the creation of NAFTA. Under the Clinton administration, North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada Canada, the United States, Mexico. What tended to happen was with free trade and lower tariffs, or no tariffs sometimes, it also encouraged the movement, not just of capital, but of people. So that was the hopeful, 90s. And now we're seeing, as you're defining this age, populist, protectionist. So you've got tariffs, but you've also, well, I guess it's hand in glove, anti-immigration sentiment, right? Close our borders, keep people out. Long term, as an economic historian, what does that do to economies?
Well, it's probably going to be good for Mexican development in the long run, to the extent that it's anything other than simply getting some headlines by sending some horses marching through Los Angeles parks looking for Mexicans to arrest and send back. In that the United States has benefited enormously over the past 300 years from its willingness to welcome all kinds of talent and all kinds of people seeking a fresh start, in a new world where you can avoid the mistakes of the old. And that's been an enormous source of American strength and American prosperity. That immigrants are people who are willing to risk things and change their lives and work hard in a strange place in order to make a better life for themselves. And those are people who you generally would very much like to have around. And if we have fewer of them around, we're going to be less prosperous as a group. And the places where they wind up, northern Mexico will wind up being more prosperous as a result. So it's surely a very bad thing for the United States, to the extent that it's really a thing at all. That there are enormous fights within the Trump administration right now between, say, the Stephen Millers who want Mexicans to go back home, to the Laura Loomers who is flirting with Trump at Mar-a-Lago these days while writing on social media that we have 65 million Mexicans we can feed to alligators. And on the other side, the remnants of the business class of the Republican Party, which wants immigrants and would be happy if the United States could get every single graduate of every Indian Institute of Technology to move to the United States, provided that they were then admitted under conditions that mean they can't quit their jobs, that if they quit their jobs, they get deported. And this fight within the Trump administration has been started, hasn't come to an end. Occasionally Trump tweets things out on Truth Social about how there need to be big changes to his own immigration policy because lots of good people, very useful to farmers, are being deported mistakenly and that big changes are coming. And yet the following day he forgets that he wrote that, as whoever had gotten to him and convinced him that his current immigration policies were wrong gets shoved out of the Oval Office and Stephen Miller reappears. Which way that will turn out, we do not know.
Right.
We do know that openness to immigrants has been the United States' principal strength over the past 3 centuries. And if that goes away, the United States will be a very, very different and much worse place.
I have one final question for you.
Yes.
The big, beautiful bill is what?
Is the most remarkable attack on the regions in which Trump's base locates I would ever have imagined possible. An awful lot of hospitals in Trump country are going to close. And an awful lot of people with chronic and acute illnesses in Trump country are going to find that the money to pay for their health care is not there. The kind of a whole bunch of improvements in potential health status in red America is going to go away with the Medicaid cuts and with the Medicare cuts that are now in train as a result of the automatic sequester provisions in the congressional rules. And in return, we've gotten absolutely nothing but another set of tax cuts for the super rich. Not even for the rich. The rich have been more hammered than benefited from Trump, first by the tariffs and then by the reduction in the tax deductibility of state and local taxes. That it's only the rich who have benefited. the Trump country, who has gotten the big shaft as a result of this. I would not have thought they would do it in the end, if only because there are going to be a lot of people trying to explain why this particular hospital was now closed, just as there are going to be a lot of Republicans who are right now trying to explain why it is that the weather forecasting, federal weather forecasting offices are all massively understaffed with half of their people missing in a time of growing global warming induced natural climate disasters hitting the country. You know, there were a bunch of people who back in the late 2010s were talking about how great the Trump tax cuts were going to be for economic growth. I think say John Cochrane at the Hoover Institution and Robert Barrow at Harvard saying it was going to boost investment in America by 25%. You know, none of this happened. They didn't have the ovaries, right? They didn't have the kind of gumption to actually say we were mistaken and you should oppose this Trump-Thune-Johnson tax cut because it didn't work out. But at least we didn't see them beating the drum for how great this particular tax cut was going to be this time. At least they felt a little bit of shame in not pushing for it.
Okay. Professor Brad DeLong, our time's up. It's been a pleasure learning from you. I thank you so much for joining us on the interview.
It's been my great pleasure. And let's hope that the next 10 years are better for the world than the last 10.
Indeed. Indeed, that's a great hope. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Okay, goodbye.